Thank you very much, John. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. I'm just kind of being stuck to the floor. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank the co-organizers of this event. A very important event here to be discussing C-51. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. What I want to do in the small amount of time that I have available is just to say a few things from the standpoint of the Institute, to talk a little bit about how Bill C-51 may affect the activities of the university in general, and a university like SFU in particular, because as most of you will probably know, the motto of the university is engaging the world. And this is something the Institute has really taken to heart. But at the same time, in engaging the world, we put ourselves in a position where we may very well fall afoul of this particular legislation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and then situate the kind of chilling climate that we've seen in this country, not just because of this legislation, but because of other aspects of the previous government's legislative agendas that have been taken together profoundly, I think, anti-democratic. And I'd like us to focus on that as well, not just focusing on this particular, particularly problematic piece of legislation, but rather the constellation of tendencies and forces within the state that move in a very anti-democratic direction. I was going to start out by just reading a letter that I had written in November 2014. It was actually November 4th, 2014, to our current president, Andrew Petter, requesting support for colleagues Lynn Quarantine, Stephen Collis, whom I'm sure you all know, who were hit, who had been hit at that time with a slap suit by Trans Mountain Pipeline, and also an injunction to cease and desist their activities on Burnaby Mountain. I basically argued that in order for us as professors at the university and SFU to fulfill our mission, our professional responsibilities of research, teaching, and community engagement, that we were, from time to time, going to be put in positions where we had to act, positions in which we had to take measures of, for example, civil disobedience, for a number of reasons. So I asked for support from the president, and it wasn't forthcoming. So I was going to read that to you. I don't have it with me. In fact, it didn't print properly, so I'm not going to read it out loud. But what I was going to do additionally is really to pose the question of what would the situation be had this particular security regime been in place at that time, and what would our president's response have been then? Would the gravity of the situation, would it have been such that a response would have been forthcoming, a supportive response would have been forthcoming from the university? I'd like to think that it would, but I can't be sure. I go on to pose the question about how in peril these professors would be, in what kind of danger would they be in terms of being apprehended by CSIS and questioned rather aggressively. My thought is that, well, perhaps not so much. However, and Audrey referred to this in her remarks after her welcome, people such as Frida Houston, Dini Togastai, people like Richard Wright, who represent the Una Stoughton camp and the Maddie Lee camp respectively. These people, these indigenous frontline land defenders, are, I think, in my view, quite at risk of falling afoul of this particular law. And by the same token, we at the Institute would be implicated as well, insofar as we have had those particular speakers appear at a conference that we organized in the spring of 2014. Some of you actually were there, and it was called The State of Extraction, and it really looked at the manner in which the extractivist project of the previous government, remember, to make Canada into the new energy superpower, had played a key role in remaking aspects of the Canadian state. And we could talk about this in the discussion period, just how it has done this. The use of omnibus bills, prorogation of Parliament, the so-called Fair Elections Act, Bill C-54, etc. And of course, the current legislation that we're discussing today. This was all part and parcel of a transformation of the Canadian state to make it into this so-called energy superpower. So this is something that I think we really need to keep our attention focused on, is the fact that it isn't so much a matter of targeting for criticism a particular government, but rather looking at the larger institutional transformation of the Canadian state as such. And this is, again, something we can come back to discuss in the Q&A period. And so the second part of my presentation was really to say that we see some evidence in this thesis globally, right? We see throughout the world a situation in which the right to dissent is now very much on the defensive. The right to dissent is being increasingly undermined. And the specific examples that I could point to are the following. There's the Italian student in Egypt who was doing research on the role of Egyptian trade unions in challenging the existing government, who was apprehended, tortured, and then murdered by the security forces. There were 19 academics in Turkey who were recently detained for unpatriotic statements in favor in support of the Kurdish minority. And in India today, there is a tremendous crisis in higher education because of the recent arrest of the JNU student union president for apparently uttering seditious statements simply by voicing concern about the death penalty that was meted out to the leader of the attackers who lodged the attacks in 1993. Some statements of solidarity with people of Kashmir and solidarity for Rohit Vemula, who was a Dalit student who was apparently, and some say, driven to suicide by the actions taken by the University of Hyderabad's administration. So we see this as a global phenomenon, a global undermining of democracy, which I would argue is part and parcel of a new phase of neoliberalism. And we could talk about what that actually is in the discussion period as well, what neoliberalism is, but a new authoritarian phase of neoliberalism that now trucks no dissent. One of the things that Margaret Thatcher said about the neoliberalism that she was in the process of really bringing into the world in the late 1970s in Britain was there was no alternative. And this wasn't the case because neoliberalism was grounded in the best possible evidence as to how social policy should operate in the Western world, and now, of course, globally, but rather it was increasingly because of a tendency of the state in a very authoritarian way to shut down the possibility of any kinds of alternatives. I see this legislation and other forms as well, including the motion that was recently passed in the House of Commons last week, condemning the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement against Israel because of its lack of compliance with international law. It's very much part of these same tendencies. So I think we need to have this larger discussion of this legislation and not think that, oh, well, if it's repealed, everything's hunky-dory, because things aren't. The last point I would make, this government has signed earlier on in the month the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is going to place further restrictions on the democratic will of people of Canada. The Special Rapporteur to the United Nations for Indigenous Rights has argued that it is going to undermine Indigenous rights. This comes into absolute conflict with the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These are the larger discussions we need to have, and we need to hold this government to their stated commitments. So I'll just end there. Thank you.